Every morning, you tell yourself, today will be different. You repeat your affirmations. You visualize success. You force a smile and think positive thoughts, and yet nothing changes. You're still stuck, still weak, still exactly where you were 6 months ago. What if I told you that positive thinking is the very thing destroying your strength? The samurai knew something that modern self-help gurus desperately don't want you to know. They understood that real power doesn't come from pretending everything is fine. It comes from accepting that everything is hard and choosing to act anyway. There's a reason the most successful people in history weren't the most optimistic. They were the most realistic. Let me take you inside the mind of someone who discovered this the hard way. His name was Kenji, 32 years old, failed entrepreneur, failed relationships, failed at almost everything he touched. But Kenji had one thing going for him. He was positive, relentlessly, exhaustingly positive. Every setback was a learning opportunity. Every setback was a learning opportunity. Every failure was just redirection. Every person who abandoned him was making room for better people. He had a positive affirmation for everything. His friends admired his optimism. His family praised his attitude. His therapist told him he was doing great. And Kenji was dying inside. Because deep down, beneath all those affirmations and forced smiles, he knew the truth. He was lying to himself. And that lie was making him weaker every single day. Here's what nobody tells you about positive thinking. It's not that it doesn't work. It's that it works backwards. Every time you tell yourself everything is fine when it clearly isn't, you're training your brain to ignore reality. Every time you force yourself to see the bright side of a disaster, you're teaching yourself to accept disasters. Every time you use positive thinking to feel better about a situation, you remove your motivation to change that situation. The samurai called this cognitive poison. They had a word for what happens when you face reality without flinching. Fudoshin, the immovable mind, not positive, not negative, unmoved. A mind that sees the mountain and doesn't pretend it's a hill. A mind that acknowledges the enemy and doesn't pretend they're friendly. A mind that accepts difficulty and doesn't waste energy wishing it were easy. Fudoshin isn't about being pessimistic. It's about being accurate. And accuracy is what creates real strength. Let me show you what happened when Kenji discovered this. His fourth business had just failed, again and again. His instinct was to reach for the positive thinking toolkit. This is just clearing the path for my real success. The universe is protecting me from something that wasn't meant for me. Everything happens for a reason, but this time something stopped him. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was a moment of clarity. But for the first time in years, Kenji let himself think a different thought. This failed because I made it fail. Not the universe, not bad timing, not circumstances. Him, his decisions, his lack of skill, his refusal to see his own weaknesses. And in that moment of brutal honesty, something shifted. Because once he stopped protecting himself with positive thinking, he could finally see what needed to change. He wasn't a victim of bad luck. He was a victim of his own delusions. The samurai understood something that modern psychology is only now beginning to prove. Studies show that unrealistic optimism leads to worse outcomes in almost every measurable category. Positive thinkers save less money. They prepare less for challenges. They're more likely to give up when things get hard because they never expected things to be hard in the first place. A study from the University of Pennsylvania found that defensive pessimists, people who imagine worst-case scenarios and plan for them, outperform optimists by nearly 40% in high-stakes situations. Think about that. The people who prepare for the worst do 40% better than the people who expect the best. Why? Because they're not wasting energy on delusion, they're spending it on preparation. Kenji started practicing what he later learned was Fudoshin. Every morning, instead of affirmations, he did something the samurai called facing the demon. He would sit quietly and list everything that could go wrong that day, not to be negative, to be prepared. He would acknowledge his weaknesses, not to beat himself up, to know where he was vulnerable. He would look at his goals and ask himself the one question, Positive thinking had never allowed him to ask, "What if I fail?" And then he would plan for that failure. He would build systems that assumed he would be lazy sometimes. He would create accountability that assumed he would be lazy sometimes. He would create accountability that assumed he would want to quit. He would design his life around the assumption that motivation is temporary and discipline is everything. He stopped trying to feel good about his situation and started trying to change his situation. The difference was immediate. Within 3 months, Kenji had made more progress than he'd made in 3 years of positive thinking, not because he was more talented, not because circumstances changed, because he stopped lying to himself. He stopped using positive thoughts as a substitute for positive action. He stopped medicating discomfort with affirmations and started using discomfort as information. Here's where most people get this wrong. They think the opposite of positive thinking is negative thinking. It's not. The opposite of positive thinking is accurate thinking. The samurai didn't walk into battle thinking they would lose, but they didn't walk into battle thinking they would win either. They walked into battle thinking they would face death, and they prepared accordingly. That preparation, that clear-eyed acceptance of reality, made them the most formidable warriors in history. Fudoshin doesn't mean expecting the worst. It means not needing to pretend about the truth. Let me show you how this works in practice. Positive thinking says, "I'm going to succeed at this new venture." Fudoshin says, "I might succeed and I might fail, so I'll build a backup plan and work harder than I think I need to." Positive thinking says, "I'm capable of achieving my goals." Fudoshin says, "I have weaknesses that will sabotage me, so I'll identify them and build systems to work around them." Positive thinking says, "Everything will work out." Fudoshin says, "Nothing works out automatically, so I'll take full responsibility for the outcome." See the difference? One makes you feel better. The other makes you better. Kenji discovered that the more honest he became with himself, the stronger he became. Not emotionally stronger at first. Actually, he felt worse in the beginning. Because honesty is uncomfortable. When you stop using positive thinking as a shield, you have to feel the full weight of your situation. You have to acknowledge that you're behind, that you've wasted time, that you're not as talented as you pretended to be, that the gap between where you are and where you want to be is enormous. But here's what happens after that initial discomfort. You stop wasting energy on delusion and start spending it on progress. You stop waiting for things to feel right and start making things right. You stop needing motivation because you've accepted that the work is hard and you're going to do it anyway. That's Fudoshin, the immovable mind, unmoved by difficulty, unmoved by fear, unmoved by the need to feel positive about everything. The samurai had a practice for developing this. They would meditate on death every morning, not to be morbid, to be free. Because once you've accepted the worst possible outcome, everything else becomes easier. Once you've looked at total failure and decided you'll act anyway, nothing can stop you. Modern positive thinking tells you to avoid thinking about failure. The samurai tells you to meditate on it until it loses its power over you. Kenji started doing this. Every morning, he would spend 5 minutes imagining his complete failure, his business collapsing, his reputation destroyed, his resources gone. And then he would ask himself one question: if all of this happened, would I stop trying? The answer was always no. And that's when he realized that fear of failure had been controlling him his entire life. Positive thinking hadn't made the fear go away. It had just covered it up. But facing it directly, accepting it completely, neutralized it. This is where positive thinking makes you weak. It teaches you to avoid discomfort instead of transforming it. It gives you temporary relief instead of permanent strength. It's the mental equivalent of taking painkillers for a broken bone instead of setting the bone properly. You feel better immediately, but you never actually heal. Here's the trap most people fall into. They think being realistic means being defeated. They think accepting difficulty means accepting mediocrity. They think acknowledging their weaknesses means giving up. But the samurai knew the opposite was true. You cannot defeat an enemy you refuse to see. You cannot overcome a weakness you won't acknowledge. You cannot climb a mountain if you keep pretending it's flat ground. Fudoshin is what allows you to see the mountain clearly and climb it anyway. Kenji's fifth business succeeded, not because he was more optimistic, because he was more accurate. He saw the obstacles before they became disasters. He fixed his weaknesses before they became failures. He prepared for problems before they arrived. And when things got hard, which they always do, he wasn't shocked or discouraged because he never expected them to be easy. The immovable mind doesn't need things to be easy. It just needs them to be real. Here's what you need to understand. Positive thinking is seductive because it feels like strength. You tell yourself empowering thoughts, and you feel empowered. You visualize success, and you feel successful. But feelings aren't results. And the gap between feeling strong and being strong is where most people's dreams go to die. The samurai didn't train their feelings. They trained their actions. They didn't need to feel brave. They needed to act despite fear. They didn't need to feel craven. They needed to perform despite doubt. That's the difference. Positive thinking focuses on how you feel. Fudoshin focuses on what you do. Now, most people make three critical mistakes when they try to apply this. First, they confuse realism with cynicism. Being realistic doesn't mean expecting to fail. It means expecting difficulty and preparing accordingly. Second, they use honesty as an excuse for inaction. Acknowledging that something is hard isn't permission to quit, it's information for how to proceed. Third, they try to eliminate all positive emotion. Fudoshin isn't about being emotionless. It's about not letting emotions override reality. The samurai felt fear, they felt doubt, they felt hope, but they never let those feelings change the facts, and they never used pleasant feelings as a substitute for effective action. Here's your challenge. For the next 7 days, stop trying to think positively. Instead, practice Fudoshin. Every morning, write down 3 things that could go wrong that day and how you'll handle them if they do. Every evening, write down 1 lie you told yourself that day and what the truth actually is. When something difficult happens, stop reaching for affirmations and ask yourself one question instead. What does this situation actually require of me? Not what do I wish it required. What does it actually require? After 7 days of this, you'll understand something the samurai knew, and modern self-help has forgotten. Strength doesn't come from believing everything will be fine. It comes from knowing everything might not be fine and choosing to act with excellence anyway. That's Fudoshin. That's the immovable mind. That's what separates people who talk about success from people who create it. The mountain doesn't care if you're positive. It only cares if you're prepared. Now tell me in the comments, what's one truth you've been avoiding with positive thinking? What's the reality you need to face to finally move forward? Because once you answer that question honestly, everything changes.